hope everybody hears me. The microphone seems to be working. My name is Anouar Majid, and I'm the director of the Center for Global Humanities. And the Center for Global Humanities is a program that involves undergraduate students as well as members of the community. Tonight, I have the great pleasure of presenting to you Robert Jay Allison. Is a professor and chair of the Department of History at the University of Suffolk in Boston. And I cannot introduce him without saying something that's the ways he has impacted me. And I'm not being in any way complimentary or unduly flattering here. In 1998, some of you, very few of you in this audience may remember, we had a colleague at the university, Professor Jack Downs, and he came to me and with a book in his hand, and he said, "Anouar, you've got to read this book." And I said, okay, so I got the book, and it was a book called The Crescent Obscured by Robert Allison, and I read it. And I was really literally jumping in my living room. I was so excited reading this book. It's about the early encounters relationship between the United States and the Islamic world. And I've been looking for some kind of scholarship of this nature, and I hadn't found it at that time. And when I read this book, and I eventually ended up reviewing it for a journal, for a Turkish journal, and I remember saying at the conclusion of my review, saying, this book is probably going to take me in an unexpected journey, and sure enough, and since you never know how books can influence you, and since 1998, I've been on this journey trying to explore the troubled, exciting, complex relationship between the United States and the world of Islam. So only for that reason, I'm so super excited and so very incredibly honored to have Robert Allison in the audience today. He also studied with the great historian of the American Revolution at Harvard. Just remind me of the name. Bailey, yes. And so he has a PhD from that institution. Robert J. Allison teaches American history, constitutional history, cultural contact in world history, the history of Boston. He is author of The Crescent Obscured, The United States and the Muslim World, 1776-1815, published initially with Oxford and now with the University of Chicago Press. And A Short History of Boston. He has edited several books, including The Interesting Narrative of Olaudah Equiano or Gustavus Vasa, the African, several volumes in the award-winning American Era series, including the Revolutionary Era, 1754-1783, and The Development of a Nation, 1783-1815. He also edited 2 volumes of 20th century American political and social history, History in Dispute, The Pursuit of Progress, 1900-1945, and The Pursuit of Liberty, 1945-2000. He is involved with several museums and historical societies in Boston, including the proposed Commonwealth Museum. He has been actively involved with the Boston History Collaborative, developing Boston by Sea, a maritime trail, featuring both land and water-based tours of Boston's maritime history. He has delivered public lectures at the Bostonian Society, the Adams National Historic Site. He has presented papers at conferences in the United States, Wales, and Turkey. And he also had a hand in my having participated in a sort of advisory group at the USS Constitution Museum in Boston when they were trying to put up an exhibit on the Barbary Wars. So an incredible fellow, and the Center for Global Humanities is delighted to welcome him tonight.
Well, thank you, Anouar. What a privilege it is to be here. First, to meet all of you, all the students, the alums, trustees, and others, but also to spend some time with my good friend Anouar Majid. I'll never forget getting a phone message one day from this very excited person saying he had read my book. And if any of you have written a book, you know how exciting it is when someone reads it and when they call you to tell you about this. An astonishing thing. And it is actually now, it's a slow year when a publisher doesn't contact me to ask if I can review a new manuscript by Anouar Majid. As he said, he's on this continuing journey. And I don't know how he does it and still has time to teach and run the Center for Global Humanities, but how fortunate you are to have him with you. He is really a treasure. Is anyone here from Boston? Should find out first. Okay, a couple of people, so I will be careful with what I say, because I'm not originally from Boston. I've lived in Boston longer than I have lived anywhere else, and I know that doesn't make me a native. My kids make fun of my accent periodically when it slips, but I do have a challenge to my students at Suffolk, where I teach, as Anouar said, Boston history. I also teach it in Harvard's Extension School, and my father-in-law thinks it's a riot that I pass myself off as a Boston historian. Do people know where you're really from, he says. If you can tell by my accent where I am from, you'll get an A in the class. And so keep listening. I know I did let it slip to some of the students here. They may be willing to divulge the information for a fee, but that's between us. And so some of you are from Boston. I know a number of you are reading this great short book about Boston, which I wrote about 8 or 10 years ago, and had to learn a lot in writing it, because, as I said, I'm not originally from Boston, and there's a lot to Boston's history, some of which you probably know, and some things you may not know. Boston, as I see it, looking at the history of Boston, you see a number of times when people attempt to do one thing and wind up doing something else, and a number of opportunities for the whole enterprise to collapse entirely. And in many ways, this is the story of history, that we're never really sure where we are going. That is, if you run into an historian who starts, well, we historians sometimes can tell you what happened. If we ever start telling you what will happen, you should turn and run, because we don't know any more than you do. We can guess, but we will probably be wrong. So Boston, as you probably know, was founded by, who founded Boston? I should ask. The students were telling me this a few minutes ago. Excuse me? The Puritans, thank you. Now, the Puritans, anyone know anything more about Puritans? They're one of these much maligned groups in our history. The 20th century, they really came in for a lot of abuse. H.L. Mencken said that a Puritan is someone who has a sneaking suspicion that someone somewhere is having a good time, and they were determined to put a stop to it. They're a little more complicated than that. I am not as fond of the Puritans, perhaps, as I should be, or maybe too fond. It's a religious movement emerging among the middle class in England in the late 15th, late 16th, early 17th century. And they had an idea of purifying the Church of England. They did not call themselves Puritans, by the way. So if you learn nothing else tonight, now you've learned one thing. I should avoid saying something is interesting just because I find it to be interesting. They didn't call themselves Puritans. They instead saw themselves as trying to turn the Church of England from the path it was on, which they feared was leading it closer to the path of the Church of Rome, which they regarded as the Antichrist, and do away with things like incense, candles, singing, stained glass, the other trapments of worship that they thought were a distraction from the real mission of the church, which should be for you to get your soul right with God. And God would not be pleased if he saw the state of your soul. I'm speaking generically, not you individually, though. If you find the message resonates, you should seek counsel. Now, in the 1620s, the hierarchy of the Church of England began to take notice of this group. The Church of England, as you should know, by the way, I should have asked, is anyone here a Congregationalist? These are the descendants of the Puritans. Is anyone here an Episcopalian? Because they're the descendants of the Church of England. Okay. By the way, Anouar, is it appropriate to ask people this? I'm always unsure if this is. And okay. You're a minister. Okay. A congregational minister? Oh, good. Welcome. I hope I get this right then. Now I know at least there is one soul in peril in the room. So, the Church of England was a political organization. That is, when the king became the head of the church, as Henry VIII did, he took upon himself the appointment of bishops and other officials. And so today, if you're in England and want to be a bishop, I think it does go through the prime minister. Let me recommend to you Anthony Trollope's 19th century novels on British politics, which involve these various appointments, including that to church hierarchy. There were two colleges in England at the time, Oxford and Cambridge for some reason became the headquarters of the dissenters, the Puritans. Now, in the 1620s, the hierarchy began clamping down on these crazy Puritans and making it tough for them to get by, and so a group began thinking of leaving England, branching out somewhere else. And this group was led by a lawyer named John Winthrop, and Winthrop, a very good lawyer, drew up a charter for the Massachusetts Bay Company under the auspices of the Council for New England. The term New England, by the way, had been given to this area. Anyone know who gave it the name New England? Yeah, you're the University of New England. Okay, this takes us back further, and if we keep going back further, by about 8 o'clock, we'll be back in the 13th century. Now, there's an earlier English plantation in North America at Jamestown, and one of the leaders at Jamestown was a character named John Smith. And John Smith had been booted out of Jamestown in about 1609 because he thought people should work 6 hours a day instead of bowling and waiting to get rich. And so they kicked poor John Smith out. And on his way back to England, he mapped the coast of this area, the area that juts out from east of the Hudson River. And he was thinking very much in imperial terms or in global terms. To the south, in the Caribbean, and in the mainland of South America and Central America, the Spanish had planted New Spain. To the north, along the St. Lawrence River, the French had planted New France. And shortly thereafter, along the Hudson River, the Dutch would plant the New Netherlands. And Smith saw this area, and he knew what a death-trap Virginia was. Terrible climate, especially in the summer. Is anyone from Virginia? Oh, okay, Reverend, I'm glad you're here. Miserable climate. So this is the thing that I think strikes anyone in New England now as odd, that someone would look at this area and think, boy, what a great climate this is. A much better place for a permanent English settlement, which Smith said will be New England. So John Smith gives us the name under which this university happily lives, New England. And this will be a bulwark against New France, New Spain, New Netherlands. Now, actually getting back to New England itself, it's fortunate, I think, for what transpires in the history of Boston, that this area does not have the one great thing that these other colonial ventures did. The Spanish found gold. The French found the fur trade along the St. Lawrence River. The Dutch also would exploit the fur trade. The Virginians ultimately discovered the tobacco. Good tobacco could be grown in Virginia, and that made Virginia prosper. But this area does not have any kind of a commodity like that can easily be traded. So the folks who came here would have to figure out some other path to survival. That's a little bit in the future. When they left England, they weren't thinking about bodily survival. They were thinking about spiritual survival. England was corrupt. England was beyond salvation with the Church of England, and you know who you are in the room, and the power of the monarch. So they left. As I said, Governor Winthrop forms the Massachusetts Bay Company to build a settlement between the Merrimack and the Neponset Rivers in what is today Massachusetts. Taking the name, actually Smith gives it the name Massachusetts Bay from the Massachusetts people, means people of the Great Hills, the Blue Hills south of what is today the city of Boston. So these were the people who lived along the rivers and along the coast of what is today the greater Boston area. And Winthrop was given a charter to go and trade in Massachusetts Bay. So it's a trading company. And Winthrop was a very shrewd lawyer. And he understood that in 1624, just as Virginia was becoming profitable, the king had taken away its charter. He'd gone to court, said the London Company really had botched the running of this enterprise, and so the king went to court, and sure enough, a judge in England said, yes, you're right, king, and they have to give the charter back. So Winthrop, when he had a charter granted to form the Massachusetts Bay Company, very wisely took the charter with him to New England, so that if the king wanted to get it, he would have to come to Massachusetts and find it. Now, in the summer of 1630, about 1,100 Puritans left Southampton on a small fleet that made its way across the Atlantic to set up a colony in what becomes Boston. At some point, we don't know whether it was before they got aboard the ship or when they were at sea, Governor Winthrop gave them their instructions. He worried what would happen when they reached shore. Would these 1,100 people all scatter and go about their own business? Would they become separate communities? Would they have the same kinds of dissensions and troubles that other communities had? And Winthrop wanted to avoid that fate because he had a strong sense that they were creating something new, a new model for the rest of the world. And so what Winthrop did was read them a sermon. This was the way you would convey a message in the 1620s to a group of Puritans, read a sermon, which he did. And the sermon was called Christian Charity, a New Model Thereof. So this is a new model for everyone of how Christian charity will inform our work in the world. And sermons, I don't know if they still do, Reverend, they begin with a little bit of text. And this one was that God Almighty, in his infinite wisdom, hath created the world so that some will be rich and some poor, some high and eminent in degree, and others meek and in subjection. And it's a fact of life. There are rich people and poor people. Here we're creating a community of rich and poor people, and what will keep them from killing one another? It's a question that still comes up periodically. Yeah. And for Winthrop, it was this idea of Christian charity. Also the idea that he frames this community on the earlier model of communities, the model of the church, which according to Christian theology is modeled on the body of Christ. And the body has different parts which all function together as one person. So what Winthrop is trying to do is create this community modeled on the body of Christ, which will be one person. Now, his conclusion is worth reflecting on as he's gone through his explanation of Christian charity and of this new community they are forming in this new world. And this is his conclusion. Thus stands the cause between God and us. We are entered into a covenant with him for this work. We have taken out a commission. The Lord hath given us leave to draw our own articles. We have professed to enterprise these and those accounts upon these and those ends. We have hereupon besought him of favor and blessing. Now, if the Lord shall please to hear us and bring us in peace to the place we desire, then hath he ratified this covenant and sealed our commission, and will expect a strict performance of the articles contained in it. Winthrop is a contract lawyer, so God has taken out a contract with the Puritans. He has allowed them to draw up the articles, and if they make it to the New World, then God has upheld his part of the bargain. He will expect the same from them. But if we shall neglect the observation of these articles, which are the ends we have propounded, and dissembling with our God, shall fall to embrace this present world and prosecute our carnal intentions, seeking great things for ourselves and our posterity, the Lord will surely break out in wrath against us and be revenged of such a people and make us know the price of the breach of such a covenant. This is extraordinary. I think Even those of us who are not ministers will understand that prosecuting carnal intentions is probably not something God would want us to do. Is that still okay? And dissembling with our God. Excuse me?
Very Old Testament.
Yeah, Old Testament. So now the new Congregationalists are for prosecuting carnal intentions? Okay. This is on tape, you know. Okay. Sorry. So that's, at least in the theology with which I grew up, that would be pretty much understood. And I don't know if the young people understand what carnal intentions are, but maybe afterwards, Reverend, you can explain. But then seeking great things for ourselves and our posterity. This will be a sign that we have failed. Not only that we have failed, but that we have broken the covenant. It's extraordinary. If we succeed, that's a sign that we have failed. Now, the only way to avoid this shipwreck and to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our community and our commission in the work, as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us as his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and glory, that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and of all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. The reason I think Winthrop probably gave this when they were on the ship is if he told these folks this before they got aboard, few would have gotten on. That is, the stakes are very high here. That is, the city upon a hill imagery comes back to us actually first in 1961 when John F. Kennedy invoked it in a speech to the Massachusetts legislature just before he became president of the United States. And then the 1980s, Ronald Reagan always made it a shining city upon a hill. And then in 1988, the governor of Massachusetts, then running for president, invoked it. So it comes back, the idea of a city upon a hill. And often we use it with the idea the world is looking on in admiration. That is, it's admiring the city upon a hill. I think Winthrop's meaning is the world is waiting for us to screw this up. Everyone sees what we're doing. And when we fail, which is inevitable, everyone is going to know it. And it's not just bad for us, it's bad for all professors for God's sake. Very high stakes in this first venture in 1630. So the Puritans, though, arrive in 1630, and they form a community on the Shawmut Peninsula and along the rivers leading into Boston Harbor, this very good harbor. And one of the reasons Boston flourishes, they stopped in Salem. There was a settlement in Salem in the late 1620s and didn't really work out that well. And so they ventured further south to the Boston area, which they settled in 1630. And actually prospered in the 1630s as more Puritans fled England. And those who had arrived here first had a benefit because they were here and they could sell stuff to the newcomers, get them started. So the first decade of this venture were quite prosperous. And then something happened that was very bad for the Puritans in Massachusetts, very good for the Puritans who had stayed in England. They wound up taking over in 1640 or so. There's a civil war in England. The Puritans who had stayed behind, those who said, yes, England is corrupt, but we are going to stay here and try to stamp out the corruption, wind up overthrowing the monarch and taking over. So England becomes a Puritan domain. It would make you feel kind of foolish if you had left because England was corrupt and you're going to set up a guidepost in Massachusetts so England could see how it could reform itself. And then in 1640, England has reformed itself. And if you want to save the world, in 1640, London would be a much more comfortable place from which to do it than Boston would. Probably even today, but don't tell anyone I said that. So this causes something of a dilemma for the Puritans. One of many dilemmas they will have as they're trying to create this new model for the world here in New England. What do? Do they pack up and go back to England, or do they make a go of it in this new world? And how will they continue surviving? And some of them have such a stake in this society, notably Governor Winthrop. They don't want to go back to England. They want to continue this new world they have created here in Massachusetts. And their salvation, I don't want to use the term salvation lightly, they're still aiming for the great hereafter, but meanwhile they do need to make a living, and they find a way to do this in the 1640s and after through trade. As I said, they don't have the great commodity of New Spain or New France. They kept imagining, though, that the rivers of Massachusetts would lead inland to the Lake of the Iroquois, teeming with beaver pelts, and they would be able to dominate the beaver trade. The rivers of New England, of Massachusetts, you probably know, go about 30 miles inland and then join up with one another. I don't know if any of you have, well, skip it. We won't talk about tracing the great headwaters of the Charles River and then the Ponset Rivers or the Merrimack Rivers. Now, they have a number of things going for them in this location, and one is great access to timber. And you can use wood for lots of things. One of the most important things they used it for was to heat their houses. Then they discovered they could build ships with wood, and they could use these ships to cart around the commodities that the other colonies were creating. The tobacco of Virginia, the sugar of the West Indies, the furs of Canada or New France, and they also could use the ships to go offshore and catch codfish. So these two things, timber and codfish, become the basis for the New England economy in the 17th century. So important that in the 18th century, when Massachusetts built its first state house, which is still standing, someone hung in the House of Representatives a wooden codfish, a symbol of the importance of the cod to the New England economy. It's still actually, when they built the new State House in the 1790s, the cod was marched with great ceremony from the old State House to the new State House, where it still hangs. And then in the 1790s, when Massachusetts built this new State House, does anyone know what's on top of the golden dome of the Massachusetts State House, by the way? I usually ask people this when they're standing in front of it and they don't get it. Anyone have a guess? Not a pineapple. You're close, though. Yes. Not an acorn, a pine cone. Okay, pine cone representing the timber of Maine, actually, which was, of course, part of Massachusetts. And it's the pine forests of Maine that help build the ships that then allow folks from Massachusetts to trade all around the world, which they do in the 17th century and in the 18th century. This is one of the phenomena here of Massachusetts, of creating trade really on their own terms, just as they had created a government on their own terms. As I said, Governor Winthrop brought the charter with him and instituted a general court of free men which would govern the colony. Puritans. I know a number of the students here are writing about the Puritans and their kind of interesting religious ideas. If you weren't here, Reverend, I would have said they're wacky religious ideas, but out of deference to you, So this trade is what leads us to the second, well, another of these great problems for Massachusetts. I realize I'm sounding very parochial and limited, looking at great world events as a problem for Massachusetts. You probably know about the classic Boston headline when World War III begins. It's Hub Man witnesses nuclear blast. Then in smaller letters, Hyde Park father of 5 slightly burned. And then in smaller letters, 27 million dead. We do tend to think a great deal about ourselves and think that the rest of the world is thinking about us. I suppose it goes back to the idea of being in a city upon a hill and the eyes of all the world are upon us. Now, the American Revolution starts off as a dispute over trade and taxes, and the British Empire in the 1760s tries to regulate this great empire that had developed through the individual enterprise of folks in the colonies. And folks in London got wind of the idea that, the folks in the colonies are doing pretty well with this extensive trade, and we should find a way to make sure the profits of the trade come to the empire. And this is what sets off the revolution. I could go into greater depth with it, but I know all of you have other things to do later in the evening. Revolution is actually one of the great stories in world history, and I don't want to get started because then we never will get out of here. So just to let you know, the Americans, the revolution begins in Boston and could not have begun anywhere else. And it begins in Boston. I'm giving you the shorthand version. Having just told you, I'm not going to tell you. Now I am telling you. Shorthand version, it begins in Boston because in Boston there is an idea of self-government that doesn't exist anywhere else. Town meetings. Each town sends its representative to the general court, and that guy's job is to do what the people in the town tell him to. And he's elected every year. Public vote in the town meeting. If you go back to the town meeting and say, gee, I couldn't get you what you wanted because other towns are more important, they're going to vote in someone who is going to go and do what you want. This is an idea of self-government that begins in Massachusetts and I hope has not quite ended in Massachusetts. So you have self-government in Massachusetts, and this is what then one of the governors of Massachusetts says the problem here is that the meanest sort of people think they run everything. 10 people can call for a town meeting, and then the town meeting happens, and whatever the town meeting decides is official town policy. He thought the big problem, this is Governor William Shirley, the big problem in Massachusetts was these mean sort of people. By mean, he meant poor, not nasty. Nasty people still have a great deal more power than they should. I think we all can agree. They have more power in Massachusetts than do anywhere else, and we need to do something to rein this in, or as he put it, to reform the democratical part of their constitution. Just a good rule of thumb. If you're studying the 18th century and someone uses the word democratical, they mean it in a very bad way. So this begins in Massachusetts with this idea of self-government, local control over elected officials, and the idea that you as a voter control your representative. In England, the idea is very much the reverse, that the members of parliament thought about the good of the empire, and they weren't beholden to the folks who had elected them. So, revolution begins in Massachusetts, and in 1780, as you know, Massachusetts drew up a new constitution, the oldest written constitution still functioning in the world. And I think by state law, I am required to say that every time I give a lecture outside the boundaries of the Commonwealth, just to remind you, even though Maine, of course, was part of this great experiment in self-government until 1820. So Massachusetts has a constitution, but there's a problem after the Revolution going back to this whole idea of trade. Trade is what had nurtured the development of Massachusetts, the growth of Massachusetts, the wealth and prosperity of Boston. And then the trade had actually been protected by the British flag, and once the war is over, the British inform the other trading partners in the world that they no longer are protecting this particular flag. So if, for example, the Algerians are allowed to attack American ships and hold their crews ransom, the subject of the book Anouar was so good to mention earlier, the British ports in the West Indies that had been the most important trading ports for Boston ships now are closed to them. British say, you want to be independent, okay, you just can't trade in British ports anymore. So they're shut out of the Caribbean by the British, they're shut out of the Mediterranean by the Algerians, and they're carrying a lot of salted cod into the Mediterranean. As you probably know, the countries on the northern bank of the Mediterranean are tended to be Catholic, and they had an injunction about not eating meat on Fridays. Therefore, there's a great market for codfish, salted codfish, which also had a great market in the West Indies, now shut out from the two biggest markets for it. One of the diplomats from New England said that these Yankee captains would sail into the mouth of hell on a rumor the devil was going to turn Catholic, because they're very venturesome. What happened? They don't sail into the mouth of hell. They do start venturing into the Pacific. And in fact, in the 1780s, a group from Boston got together and pooled their resources and sent a ship to the Pacific Northwest. Actually, one of the ships was called the Columbia. The other was called the Lady Washington. And these two ships reached the Pacific Northwest. And what did they call the river they found in the Pacific Northwest? The Columbia, thank you. And actually, this is why in towns in the Pacific Northwest we find places named Portland and Salem and others that have a familiar ring to us. But their goal wasn't simply to go and trade with the native people in the Pacific Northwest. Their goal was to get otter skins from the Pacific Northwest, take them across the Pacific to China, and trade the otter skins in China for tea or for silver, which they did. So that in 1788, this is 15 years after Bostonians destroyed tea sent by the British East India Company, a Boston ship brings a cargo of tea directly from Guangzhou, which they then called Canton, opening a trade across the Pacific that will make Boston rich, or make Boston prosper in the early part of the Republican era. So much so that in 1793, one of the Indian towns south of Boston that had been known as Punkapog has its name changed to Canton in recognition of this trade with China. And even in the end, to the end of the 19th century, Americans in Canton were called Boston men because these were the only Americans that folks in Guangzhou got to meet, these Boston men. So the Bostonians open up this trade with China that develops or brings tremendous wealth into New England. And then in 1808, as you're probably aware, President Jefferson imposed an embargo on all trade as a way of teaching the European powers a lesson. It doesn't really teach them a lesson. We can talk about the embargo some other night. What it does is shut off all trade. And these guys who had their capital invested in ships no longer can send their ships to China, and so they turn to something else. Actually, they turn to developing a textile industry with the wealth begun in the China trade. And so the textile industry, which develops in New England after about 1815, one of the great phenomena, turning New England into one of the most industrial areas in the world. The Merrimack River Valley, all of these rivers that initially the Puritans had thought would lead inland, if not to the Northwest Passage, at least to the Lake of the Iroquois, don't really lead anywhere. There's this mountain range quite close inland. The rivers of New England actually have a steeper drop than most other rivers in the world, so they're great for generating power. And so the rivers of New England then are turned to generating power to drive textiles. And New England becomes a center of a textile industry. New England becomes a center, but Boston becomes the hub of this. In an interesting way, that even though New England as a whole is prospering, it is Boston as the center of this, or Boston remains this metropolis as the rest of the area is transforming. This is one of the great phenomena of Boston, its staying power. At the time of the Revolution, there was an idea of moving the capital from Boston to some other place. In 1787, Shays rebels, these guys in western southern Mass, and even here, wanted to move the capital someplace closer to the heartland. And as you probably know, in just about every other state after independence, the capital did move inland. South Carolina, New York, North Carolina, Georgia. I'm not just going down the list of states whose names I know. These actually do have their capitals move inland. But Massachusetts doesn't. Boston stays the capital. And when the textile industry develops along the Merrimack River, the Bostonians had already built a canal connecting the Merrimack with Boston, the Middlesex Canal, so that the goods being produced in Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill will come through Boston. The cotton being shipped up to these textile mills will go through Boston instead of through Salem or Newburyport or one of these other places with easier access to the mouth of the Merrimack. So the Bostonians build canals, then they begin building railroads, and this is why Boston becomes known as the hub, because of the number of railroad lines intersecting in Boston or generating out from Boston, like the radii around a hub, which Boston was. Actually, the term hub refers to the State House. I believe it was Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. who said that the Massachusetts State House is the hub of the solar system. I wasn't thinking about the hub of New England or the hub of North America. No, the hub of the solar system. I suppose this is one of the reasons that we Bostonians are rarely asked to leave town and talk about our hometown, right? You're probably reconsidering this invitation as I speak, Anouar. So, okay. One guy who really didn't like Boston in the 19th century was Edgar Allan Poe, born in Boston. His mother was an actress, and Poe had a lifelong hatred for Boston. This is the time when Boston considers itself the center of American literature and intellectual life, which it may well have been. The Athens of America might be kind of an extreme expression, particularly when you realize, those of you who have read the Peloponnesian War, that Sparta won. But Poe, he became quite a noted literary critic, and literary critic you wouldn't want to mess with. He said he accused Henry Wadsworth Longfellow of being a plagiarist. Probably some form of heresy to come to Portland and repeat what Poe said about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Bad poet and a plagiarist, which I guess is worse. He's copying other bad poets, he said. But he also, Bostonians, he thought, were rather too trumped up with their own feelings of importance. In the center of Boston Common, there was and is a pond called the Frog Pond. And it's called Frog Pond, obviously, because there were frogs in it. And Poe called all of Boston Frogpondia. And the Bostonians were Frogpondians. And if you think about what he meant, frogs make a lot of noise. But if you really look at them, what do they have to show for it? The loudest bullfrog isn't that impressive to look at. So the Bostonians are like a lot of bullfrogs trumpeting about how great they are and how great this frog pond is. But after all, they're frogs. These are the kinds of things, I suppose, that made Poe not the most popular literary figure in Boston. I think if I were a real Bostonian, I would now point out that Poe had a drinking problem and came to a bad end in a gutter in Baltimore. So, he didn't like Boston because of this idea. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, who had a way with words, also said that in Boston, they measure buildings by the State House, land by Boston Common, and men by Edward Everett. Now, enough with Holmes. Another Bostonian, E.L. Godkin, who published The Atlantic, a literary journal of the 19th century, which I believe is still going, said that in Boston is the one place where you find wealth and the knowledge of what to do with it in the same hands. And this is one of the things that makes Boston prosper in the 19th century, was the collegial relationship between the folks who made their fortunes in the textile industry or in the China trade, and fortunes that came from poor people, actually, who figured out how to build machinery or how to sail a ship to China and bring stuff back. These are tough merchant captains engaging in the China trade, and it makes them rich. And then their children will marry the children of better educated folks. This is why Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is able to move into one of the most elegant houses in Boston, in Massachusetts. His home had been built in the 17th century by a West India trader, the Vassall family, one of the wealthiest families in British North America. Their fortune came from the West Indian sugar trade, and they built a series of mansions in Massachusetts and in Cambridge. This one is. Has anyone been to the Longfellow house in Cambridge? A number of you have. Beautiful place. And Longfellow married the daughter of a fellow named Apthorpe, and the Apthorpes were very wealthy from the textile industry, first from trade. And as a wedding present, Fanny Apthorpe's father gave them the Vassall house, which is now known as the Longfellow house. The Vassalls had been, I guess the estate was appropriated by the Commonwealth back in 1775. So an interesting collaboration among the intellectuals like Longfellow and the industrialists, as both each will rely on the other in this period of extraordinary change in Boston. And in the 1880s, it's worth noting, Boston remained a center for innovation. In some ways, it does become kind of stale. One of the great stories of the 1850s is that a fellow came from Nova Scotia to Boston to build clipper ships. Donald Mackay builds the fastest clipper ships ever to sail to get to the Pacific coast. This is at the time of the California gold rush. And Mackay builds these great ships that make the trip around Cape Horn in 79 days, an extraordinary feat. Now, this is at a time when other folks are investing in steam power, which becomes the future of navigation. So in some ways, Boston is investing a lot in something that already was obsolete. But then there are other folks coming to Massachusetts, becoming innovators in other ways. So an extraordinary period in the 1870s, you have Alexander Graham Bell in one little apartment in Scully Square inventing the telephone, and in another apartment nearby, Thomas Edison is working on electricity. Edison actually had come to Boston. You know what machine he was working on when he came to Boston? Excuse me? Not the ticker tape machine. He was actually working on a voting machine. And you see, this is another innovation of Bostonians make. Great strides in counting ballots in this period. Yeah, he had done the ticker tape machine, but then he also develops an electric company. So there are lights in Faneuil Hall installed by Edison in the 1880s. Yeah, politics, a great story in Boston, which I don't know that we have time to talk about tonight, but this is great changes in Boston, as you have still this idea of forming a community out of disparate elements, the rich, the poor, those high and eminent, and others meek and in subjection, forming one community. And we see this through 4 centuries of Boston's history. As different folks have emerged, come into Boston. In the 19th century, tremendous immigration from Ireland, beginning really in the 18 teens and 20s, and then exploding in the 1840s, transforming Boston. And then in the late 19th century, Germans, Jews, and Italians coming into Boston and transforming it further, but all creating the same, working with the same ethic, this ethic of hard work, idea of a community, of looking over your shoulder, as Boston continues to be transformed by the folks who emerge into Boston, coming for one reason or another, and surviving and prospering. I think at this point I will stop, and if you have questions, I will be happy to answer them. Oh, I see. We're recording this. Part of the deposition.
Thank you very much for coming.
Actually, this gentleman in back, yes.
In your book, you mentioned the Brook Farm community in West Roxbury. And was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little more, and in particular, why they didn't make a better choice for land, because it seems like it could have done a lot better if they had found some better farming land.
Yeah, okay, so the question is about Brook Farm, which was this utopian community in West Roxbury, started by the Transcendentalists in, the 1840s, I think, and Hawthorne wrote a good novel about it. Hawthorne had a jaded view of it. Your question, though, is why didn't they choose better land? And I don't know. I mean, if you think about it, there really isn't a whole lot of good land around Boston. I think utopian communities in and of themselves will have problems, as Hawthorne gets at in the Blithedale Romance. It's a good question. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Maybe proximity,
Yeah.
but, which hurt them in a sense too. I guess the nail in the coffin was when the big structure burned down and the fire department showed up a couple days late.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's both a blessing and a curse. Being close to Boston, which means you can walk back, but then you're still, rather like Henry David Thoreau, living in this cabin in the woods, but then going to have dinner with his mother every Sunday. And one of my favorite parts of Walden is where he's goes to visit some people in town, and the couple have gone to bed, and he's still sitting in the living room thinking about their blighted lives. I'm just thinking about what's the conversation going on in the bedroom? How are you going to get this guy out of here? I think is probably what they're saying. This gentleman had a question first. Yes.
You mentioned at the beginning about Winthrop's idea of coming together as different parts of one body, and whether this ideal, has continued into present-day Boston or into our century with the various ethnic groups that you mentioned at the end of your lecture. Well, how different groups each have sort of claimed their own turf. Whether that's still the case, whether individual or whether communities are still sort of ethnically different from other communities, and whether they do come together as one city, one body. Could you talk about that question a little bit?
Yeah, that's a very good question, very interesting question, and very perplexing question. Is Boston? It is too romantic to say, oh, gee, everybody comes together and forms one. As Boston, as you said, was in many ways, communities did form their own enclaves. And it wasn't simply a matter of, say, the North End in the 19th century was Irish, then it became Jewish and Italian. Each block would be different. And the block would be the people from Sligo here, and the people from Derry here, and the people from Donegal here. It wasn't as, oh, gee, we're all Irish. In fact, Irish identity only develops here. The same with being Italian. You didn't come from Italy. You came from a village near Naples, and someone else came from a different village, and it doesn't. Families don't get along, as you may know. That so why do we think people of one ethnicity will? But they can turn then on someone who isn't from that ethnicity. The different neighborhoods did have a certain caste to them, an ethnic caste. So initially, the north slope of Beacon Hill became the black community. Initially, blacks had lived in the North End. When Boston, just to back up a bit, in the 18th century, when Boston was virtually, almost entirely what we would call Yankee, biggest event every year was November 5th, when Pope's Day. And this group from the South End, group of longshoremen, dock workers, and so on, would make an effigy of the Pope. I should tell you, I went to tell my kids in my kids' school about Pope's Day once, St. Bridget's School in South Boston, and the kids got all excited at first when I mentioned Pope's Day, and then when I explained the purpose of it was these people really hated the Pope, and so they made an effigy of the Pope. They would drag it through the streets and go into his taverns demanding to be served, And these guys get really much drunker and drunker. They also like it if you illuminate your windows with, say, you make a cutout of the Pope and the devil, something that says, "I hate the Pope." What do you think, Hillary? Are you going to do this? Okay. So, yeah, so that's good. Because if you don't illuminate your windows, we get to smash them. And now there's a certain demographic, I am told, of young men between the ages of, say, 16 and 30 who find it really fun to go get drunk, smash windows, and Brandon, you have any thoughts on this? I like to look around the audience and see the students have things. Yeah. And then, so you have a North End group with their effigy of the Pope, South End group with their effigy of the Pope. They get together in Dock Square, and what do you think they do? They fight. Yeah, they have a free-for-all. Each group tries to capture the other one's Pope. And if the North End group captures the South End Pope, they have a bonfire in Dock Square. If the South End group captures the North End Pope, they drag it to the Common and have a bonfire there. So fire, I think, was the other thing that the young guys were waiting for. Oh, yeah, a bonfire at the end of this. This is a huge thing. It's entirely Yankee, but the South End group hates the North End group just because they live in a different part of town. This is human nature, I suppose. I don't know, Reverend. Maybe we'll have to talk about this later on. So 19th century, actually beginning really in the, I know someone here is writing about Goodwife Glover, who's writing about Goodwife Glover? Okay. There's an allegation that she was executed for being a witch, but more recently, Tom O'Connor, who is the dean of Boston historians and for many years a professor at Boston College, said actually she was a victim of anti-Catholic prejudice. She could say the Lord's Prayer in Latin, but not in English. She spoke Gaelic. I don't know, what do you think? Victim of anti-Catholic prejudice, or was she a witch? Her husband said she was a witch. Okay. Good question. You know, there's a bar now in the North End called Goody Glover's. Have you been there? Part of your research? Okay. So, so as different ethnic folks of different ethnicities move in, they, either adapt or, I guess adapt or die is kind of one of the truisms of life. What happens with the Irish is they do come to dominate city politics, which is fascinating because they hadn't been able to vote at home, but they see politics becomes the route for advancement. And so really smart guys like John Fitzgerald or Martin LeMasney see a way of making this political system work to their advantage, creating the whole idea of the ward boss. Martin LeMasney hated being called a ward boss, so someone said, how about if we call you the Mahatma? And when he found out what a Mahatma was, he really liked that. I had a student from India a few years ago who was really excited first when she found out Boston had Brahmins. And then when she found out it even had a Mahatma, she really came to love Boston all the more. And then, of course, James Michael Curley, who becomes the real genius of politics in Boston. He puts the ward bosses out of business because he makes himself the center of all of this. I know we're getting a far way away from your question about ethnicity and lines. Is it working? Well, yes and no. I mean, Boston has, as other cities do, a lot of problems. It had them in the 20th century. Some are exacerbated by ethnicity. In other ways, ethnicity has been a way of bringing people together. At least you can agree on something. I think the good answer is, I don't know.
Two questions. Would you comment on when and how Boston became one of the truly great higher educational centers, really of the country and eventually of the world, I guess? And secondly, unrelated to it, given the strong Protestant and anti-Catholic bias, when and how did the Catholic Church become such a prominent organization in Boston?
Two very good questions. First school in the country, you should know, 1635, Boston Latin. I have one son who was class of 08 and another we hope will be the class of 2011. We haven't gotten, his grades are better this year. So it has an educational tradition. And then, of course, Harvard was founded in 1636. But that's a different question, really. And I think the idea of Boston as a center for higher education really takes off in relationship almost to the question this gentleman asked before. And when I get to the end of answering your first question, you'll have to remind me. The second one was on the Catholic Church. Okay. 19th century, tremendous immigration into the United States as a whole. and a real fear of what will we have separate tiers of citizens. And Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Constitution actually calls for each town to support grammar schools. And in the 1830s, Massachusetts creates a commissioner of education. Horace Mann is the first secretary of the Education Commission, and he makes a tour of the Commonwealth to inspect schools, and then requires all schools to be uniform. The idea is you have this immigrant population, it has to be educated. If not, you will have separate tiers. You will have people who will never be part of the body politic, which the Massachusetts Constitution speaks of. So you have the creation of public schools in Massachusetts, and in the middle of the century, you already had Harvard, of course. Trying to think if there are others. The other schools really begin developing in the 19th century. MIT is created mid-century as a place to learn mechanical arts, useful things. Holy Cross, or the College of the Holy Cross, in I think the 1840s. Again, higher education so that you don't have people stuck in menial positions. It's a transformation of higher education going on in the 19th century. And I suspect this institution was part of that, the idea of an academy to teach people useful things. The real boom in education, though, we have schools being created for a variety of reasons. In the 19th century, the real boom in education happens after World War II with the GI Bill. Yes, Boston still had been a blue-collar town up until World War II. In fact, the high schools of Boston, aside from the Latin school, which I've mentioned, where you would go to learn Latin, and Latin wasn't what you needed in order to go to college. You have the high schools, which really develop around the turn of the 20th century, train people in useful things. So South Boston High School, the principal major was sheet metal work. Charlestown, I think it was auto mechanics, and Brighton was being an electrician. That is, each school was essentially a trade school. There also was a commerce school if you're going to become a clerk or something. If you're going to go to college, you went to Latin. And it creates it does create a certain degree of segregation in employment. But on the other hand, how many ministers do you need, which is what Harvard turned out. How many do you need, Reverend? So you need a practical education, and it's really the GI Bill that then transforms the whole American economy from one of a blue-collar industrial economy into a service economy or a managerial economy, which is what we have today. How well is that working? I couldn't tell you, and I think that would be the subject for another lecture. Second question on the Catholic Church, which other than Goodwife Glover, there probably were Catholics, even though it was against the law to be a Catholic in the British Empire, actually, until the Quebec Act of 1773, where the British had taken Canada and said, well, we'll let the French Canadians keep their religion, which actually was very controversial in Massachusetts. Boston considered the Quebec Act one of the intolerable acts. Why are they letting papists, which is what they called Catholics, keep their religion? And Bostonians still wanted to observe Pope's Day. 1775, George Washington has arrived to take command of the Continental Army. He knows that the United States is trying to get support from the French, and he hears that soldiers in this New England army are about to celebrate Pope's Day. And he's outraged. And he says, no, you cannot have anything to do with this childish custom. Especially now, we're trying to make an alliance with France. The King of France is His Most Christian Majesty. He's a Catholic, so 1778, actually, there are Pope's Day riots when there's a French fleet in Boston. Actually, this is a true story. There's an army of British prisoners of war, Burgoyne's army, that had been captured at Saratoga. They were in Boston. And there are these French sailors in town. And the Bostonians decide to observe Pope's Day. And they get into this big brawl and start attacking the French sailors. The British soldiers come to the rescue of the French. The French are on the side of the Americans in this war, but here in Boston, anyway, in the 1790s, the French have a revolution which overthrows the monarchy and also disestablishes the church. and a lot of French exiles come to Boston, including a French priest, Father Matignon, and then shortly thereafter, Father Cheverus, or Cheverus. And in 1808, Boston becomes a diocese. There was one diocese in the United States in Baltimore, and in 1808, the Pope created the diocese in New York, one in Philadelphia, one in Boston, and one in what's now Lexington, Kentucky. Okay, so Boston now has a bishop, Bishop Cheverus, and Cheverus realizes to get along in Boston, you have to get along with the Yankee elite, and does pretty well, actually. Builds a cathedral with support from a lot of the Protestants. 1830s, his successor is a guy named Bishop Fenwick, and Cheverus is French. He realizes, I'm not from this country, I need to learn to get along. Fenwick's from Baltimore. He's an American, doesn't need to apologize to anybody for anything. And this doesn't sit well with some of the Bostonians, and he wants to put a cemetery on Bunker Hill. There already is a cemetery on Bunker Hill for Protestants. It's illegal to bury Catholics in Massachusetts at this time, just as it's illegal to bury Jews in Massachusetts at this time. Cheverus says, I want to have a cemetery here. Charlestown selectmen say, oh no, that would endanger the public health. And Cheverus is a belligerent enough guy. He also has a convent school outside of in Charlestown. And rumors swirls about what's going on inside the convent school. The children at the convent school, it was a school for girls, were all Unitarians. This is at a time when there was a split in the Congregational Church. It's kind of the old line Congregationalists, the descendants of the Puritans, and then is anyone here a Unitarian, by the way? That's a change in religious thinking. We'll get their names, Reverend. So the children of Unitarians are going to the convent school. The children of the Congregationalists are going to the public schools. And at the convent school, the girls would learn things like French and science and things they wouldn't learn in the public school because it wasn't important to teach girls things like French and science. I don't know, is that important today? Okay. So a mob from Charlestown goes and burns down the convent school. It's a way of getting even, showing who's boss. And now, the upper-class Bostonians are outraged at this act of arson. It's this lower class, well, I don't want to use terms like class, but it is. It's a holdover of this anti-Catholicism you mentioned. And it simply is 1850s, there's such a great number of Catholics in Boston. The thing that really changes, though, is the Civil War, where Irish Catholics fight for the Union, seeing the benefit of the Union. And it's really the Civil War that brings Irish Americans, as well as African Americans, into the fold of citizenship. And by the turn of the 20th century, they have come to dominate the city. And you had a number of mayors and political figures who, like Cheverus, thought, well, we should find some accommodation with the powers that be. And then you have someone like James Michael Curley who says, well, wait a minute, we're really running the show here. These are the ones with, well, I could spend all night talking about James Michael Curley if you let me, so we'll leave it at that. It's simply a demographic change, different leadership in the church as well as in politics that leads to this shift. And it's really by the 20th century that, in Dorchester, you would know someone by what parish they were from at one time.
Wasn't it, I'm not sure, but wasn't it 1836 when Massachusetts, the last state in the Union at the time, disestablished? I mean, wasn't that the stronghold of anti-disestablishmentarianism? And in a way, that turn there started to pull the meeting house away from the center of the political realm.
Yeah, it's a long story in Massachusetts, and it was at this time, really early 19th century, when you see, I think the first early 19th century was the split between the Unitarians and the Congregationalists. Okay, so
Sure.
the congregation, let's suppose the congregation decides to become Unitarian and the minister doesn't, or the minister becomes Unitarian and the congregation says, well, wait a minute, we're Congregationalists. And the question is, who controls the meeting house? Because the meeting house is a public space. The town supports it. And this had been under fire, actually, long before this. In 1774, when the First Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia, John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock go down to bring the spite of Massachusetts, hope the other colonies will come in and join Massachusetts in its war against the British. And another guy from Massachusetts shows up uninvited, Isaac Backus. He's a Baptist minister. And he says, hey, you know, the no taxation without representation thing, my congregation has to pay taxes to support the Congregational Church. Is that fair? You know, it says this in Philadelphia, where there's a Catholic church, a Quaker meeting house, an Anglican church, you know. So they say, well, no, actually it isn't. And they tell the Adamses and Hancock, you have to do something about the Baptists. And they say, this is just a trick by the Tories to try to divide us. Of course they should pay taxes to support the congregational clergy. Is anyone here a Baptist, by the way? and the Adamses and Hancock are really offended when Congress invites Backus to offer prayers at Congress. And he says, how come we have to pay taxes to support the Congregational Church? And he says to these guys who say, well, don't you believe in religion? Well, yeah, he does. He's a Baptist minister. He says, well, why don't you pay taxes to support the Church of England? That is, there's an Anglican minister in Boston. Why aren't you paying to support him? So this issue had been raised before, but in an overwhelmingly congregational state, there's not much you can do about it. Of course, in Virginia, the Baptists are able to use their power, say, hey, we'll sit out the war. And the Virginia establishment says, well, we actually need them. So the Virginia establishment comes up with the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, really at the instigation of the Baptists. If you value religious freedom, there's a long list of people to thank, beginning, I think, with the Baptists. And we get to the Congregationalists eventually. But then what happens in the early 19th century is a split between the Congregationalists and the Unitarians inside the same denomination. And then the argument about, well, who controls the parish? Well, as you said, is each town going to vote? Well, maybe it's better just to distance the whole structure from it. In 1820, when Massachusetts had revised its constitution, John Adams, who's now in his 80s and had written the Constitution in 1780, goes to this convention to try to argue for a disestablishment of the Congregational Church. He loses. Congregationalists don't want this, and it's only with this split with the Unitarians that you have this. The meeting houses stop being the center of the community, being each town is a parish. I don't know if that, yes, sir.
The other thing I just wanted along those lines, in that we like to hold on to those doctrines and those documents that established us, and Winthrop's being very, very much the case in Massachusetts. Isn't Hawthorne's novels, don't they sort of, are they commentaries on that whole prospect, the whole issue of what Winthrop saw as what was going to exist in that colony?
Oh, definitely. Hawthorne's novels I would recommend, and his short stories, too, because they really are about not only what happened, but what's going on in the minds of these people. Whether you're in Salem in the 1690s or whether you're in Boston in the 1770s, it really is a great window into this world. I think we can make the mistake of looking at Hawthorne and reading back and saying, okay, these are historical novels, so this, the Scarlet Letter is historically true about the 1640s, when actually Hawthorne's writing it in the 19th century. That is, he is looking back, and he is thinking back with what he knows in the 19th century about the 17th century, like Young Goodman Brown or The Man of Adamant or these other short stories. I'm a little embarrassed talking about American literature with Professor Majid sitting here. Is probably, but yeah, it is a great commentary on this mindset. Hawthorne really didn't like the Puritans that much. He's fascinated with them, though. Any other? Yes, sir.
Were there others than Roger Williams who were pushed down the city on the hill?
Yeah, others than Roger Williams, yes. Anne Hutchinson being, of course, one of the main ones. Williams had an advantage in that he was an ordained minister. He was one of the great Puritan ministers of the period. He was a celebrity. and they were really excited when he came, and then he started having these other quirky ideas about what the worship should be like. And Anne Hutchinson, of course, is a heretic. The Quakers, you invite this almost. You break from the Church of England because you want each individual has to have a direct relationship with God. So then how can you have any kind of a hierarchy? The Church of England, you have bishops and an archbishop who set policy, just as the Church of Rome has a pope and cardinals and control what you as the individual will know about the faith. But here, everyone's going to be reading the Bible. This is exactly what the Church of Rome said would happen. Everyone reads the Bible. Everyone comes to their own interpretation of things. And you have someone like Anne Hutchinson saying, well, this is how I interpret it, and the way the Reverend Wilson is interpreting it is wrong. And so Anne Hutchinson starts holding meetings in her house, and people come to listen to her because it turns out she's a more exciting preacher than the Reverend Wilson. I don't know how you feel about that, but Reverend Wilson gets pretty sore, and so do the authorities, because, well, what will happen? Is everyone going to start their own church? They say, okay, well, we won't have the hierarchy, but we will still have ordained ministers who have a license to preach. And Hutchinson and Roger Williams think, well, why is that? Similar argument to what the Baptists will have. So one thing that happens, one reason you don't see Boston continuing to push people out is simply because by the end of the 18th century, 17th century, you have much more hospitable places to go if you want to leave England, notably Pennsylvania, which really booms. In 10 years, Pennsylvania has the same population that it had taken Massachusetts about 50 years to get, because it's a much more hospitable place. If you're, in Massachusetts, not only was it against the law to be a Quaker, it was against the law to entertain a Quaker. It was a £5 fine for entertaining a Quaker. I don't know if it would be worth it to any of you folks to entertain a Quaker on those terms. If you were a Quaker, the mildest punishment would be have your wrists tied to a wagon, which then would be led through town as the magistrate whipped you. So everyone could see this is what we do to Quakers. And of course, Mary Dyer, the inner voice keeps telling her to come back, and the authorities in Boston keep telling her if you come back, they'll execute you. And sure enough, they do. So, yeah, it's a very inhospitable place to outsiders. And this is one of the things periodically folks say, oh, yeah, it's still inhospitable to outsiders. I don't know. I mean, I came from nowhere, and they haven't thrown me out yet. But, it's part of an idea of creating a godly commonwealth, and how do you protect it? And not only against other Europeans, but also against Native Americans, as they are part of the problem. It's okay if they want to convert, that's one story, and they will have to change everything about themselves. This is why John Eliot translates the Bible into the Algonquian language so that the Indians can learn the gospel. A valuable thing. It's one reason we know the Massachusetts language is because Eliot translated the Bible into it. But then in order to become a Christian, it's not just, okay, on Sunday you're going to do this instead of doing whatever he did. It's a complete change in the way of life, according to the Puritans, as it would have been according to the Indians, as both lived in a spiritual realm where everything you did was informed by your thoughts of the hereafter, whether you were a Puritan or whether you were an Indian, and they had a different sense of what that meant, as well as incompatible ways of life and economic systems. So the answer to your question is yes, there were others. Over here.
It interested me in how the geography of Boston contributed to the social architecture in the early time of Boston. Do you think an element of that exists today in the social architecture of Boston today?
Yeah, that's a good question, how the geography of Boston still influences. Yeah, you see, for example, East Boston, which is near Logan Airport, 19th century, this was a haven for immigrants because this is where the ships docked. Now, of course, is where the airport is. So in the early 1980s, it still was an Italian neighborhood. It had been an Irish neighborhood early 20th century, became an Italian neighborhood, and that increased as folks moved out of the North End, displaced by the Central Artery. Then in the late 1980s, early 1990s, a lot of Salvadorans began moving in. And today the neighborhood is Salvadoran and Brazilian. again, because the airport is there. And what will happen is one person will move to a place for whatever reason, then other people will come. And you see this too. As I said, the African American community lived on the north slope of Beacon Hill. And then as a wave of immigration in the late 19th century came, Jewish and Italian immigrants moving into that area, which then was called the West End, the African Americans moved out because the immigrants were letting their houses, they weren't keeping up their houses as well as, it was a middle-class black community by this time. So they moved out first to either to Cambridge or to the south end of Boston. And then as in the early 20th century, more African Americans moved in, mainly to the south end, because that's where the railroad lines turned out. And this same time, there's actually a Jewish community emerging in the south end. Then in the post-World War I, World War II era, there's an influx of African Americans mainly from the south, who also will move into the south end, and that spreads into Roxbury and Dorchester. That is areas that are contiguous. You usually don't see people leapfrogging. Then in the 1960s, there was an exodus of Jews from Boston who mainly lived in the area around Mattapan, and they went to Sharon or the areas immediately south of Boston. The African American community that moved into Mattapan, as folks became more successful and didn't want to live in what was becoming really an inhospitable place, also moved out, but to Randolph, that is moving to the next town over. You're not jumping, not moving, say, from Dorchester to Plymouth. You would move from Dorchester to Braintree. It's something you see in the after the 1970s, with the cataclysm of busing, the migration out from South Boston and Dorchester was to Quincy and Braintree, and from Charlestown would be to Everett and Revere, and from East Boston into Everett and Revere. You know, as people don't move huge distances unless they have the means or the wherewithal. It's an interesting question. So I guess my answer to that also is yes, and it's something you've just made me think about.
What were some of the factors that led Maine to separate from Massachusetts, more from the Massachusetts side than from this
Okay.
side?
Factors that led Maine to separate. Great story, actually, about this. Surprisingly enough, it involves politics. Maine, the short answer, Maine was becoming, the big split was between Federalists and Republicans. Okay? Jefferson was a Republican. The Adamses had been Federalists. Everywhere else in the country, the Federalists are dying out, except in Massachusetts. Maine, though, is becoming very much Republican, and Maine was growing very fast. Federalists in Massachusetts realized, if we really want to hold on to power in Massachusetts, it would be good if we lobbed off, tens of thousands of Republican votes, and one way of doing that is let Maine become its own state. So, yeah, it's, I guess it's what we might call gerrymandering, So that's essentially it. At 1820, there had been a push in Maine because of, getting to Boston and so on. But the real impetus, or why the Massachusetts agrees to it, is to get rid of all these Republican voters. So maybe the Federalists will be able to hold on a little longer in Massachusetts, which they do. Mainly the Federalists become Whigs, ultimately. But that's the short answer, I guess. I should have asked a Mainer what their story is.
Hi, thank you. I just wondered if you could say something about Boston marriages, and also why Boston is so difficult to get around, as opposed to New York City, which has grids and everything.
You hear that.
Thanks.
Boston marriages. Okay, this is another 19th century phenomenon. Usually would be women who live together without any real comment. It was a different era when people, it was the Victorian era when we really weren't talking about whatever it was you did in private. So respectable women who would live together, and I think it was it Henry James who coined the term Boston marriage in the novel The Bostonians. He has a couple of characters who are, that's all I know really, the Boston marriage. And anyway, does that answer your question? Why in Boston as opposed to somewhere else? Perhaps it's the whole idea of culture, I think, that it wasn't that unusual for women to be educated in Boston, and in this period, so you have educated women first. Secondly, this is the era after the Civil War when there aren't as many men. Women would inherit from their fathers, and so they would have a respectable life and wouldn't marry a man. They would, but why didn't this happen in New York? I don't know. Good question. I'll have to look into this. One of the great things about having people to talk to is you get good questions that then can propel you to think about things. Maybe one of the students who's tackling research on this can look into this, the Boston marriage, which is a very interesting phenomenon. I'm just thinking about a number of examples of this, but so difficult to get around. The rumor that the streets were cow paths is actually not true. Okay, the common had cow paths, but no, the other streets did not. I suspect it is because, Philadelphia is set up on a grid. Penn had this great idea of a grid, and it works, okay? Boston didn't. It had this kind of narrow topography initially on the Shawmut Peninsula. 19th century, when they build the Back Bay, they do build long avenues that intersect. South Boston, East Boston also have a grid pattern. But all of these places come together. Roxbury had been an independent farm town, and your purpose when you're laying out roads in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s isn't necessarily to get, from here to there quickly, or putting in places for people to live and other things. Everything is close by. It's probably the topography of Boston that shapes the roads more than anything else. The naming of the roads is something else. I remember hearing a comedian talk about how easy it is to get around. People complain about getting around in New York. All you need to do is count. You're on 33rd Street. You need to go to 71st Street. You turn right. Boston, you have to remember who was born first, Samuel Adams or George Washington. And then, of course, Washington Street itself. The reason it's unique is every street that crosses it changes its name. Well, that's great if you were in Boston and are walking around, but if you're on Nealon Street and you want to get to Boylston Street, you don't really know how. You don't know it's going to, you don't know Nealon Street's going to turn into Stewart Street, or Boylston Street's going to turn into Essex Street, or Winter Street will turn into Summer Street. I don't know, maybe it's partly our way of keeping out people who don't belong here. And telling people, I can't tell you how to get there, even though I know. I would, it does come up. One way you're a Bostonian, though, is everything is a 5-minute walk. That's what we tell outsiders.